So, last Sunday I posted part 2 of our story about the life of Disney artist Herb Ryman. And for this Sunday, the original plan was to record and post the 3rd chapter in that story. But that's not how this last week turned out. Last Sunday, I was out in Florida talking with people doing some research and spending a little time in the parks. On Sunday night around 5 p.m., I went over to Epcot. It was a normal, if crowded, Sunday. I looked at the holiday light overlay on Living with the Land. I took some photos of the Epcot Christmas tree. I took another spin on Cosmic Rewind, and then I took some photos of the entrance plaza and headed back to my hotel. And somewhere between leaving the park and arriving at my hotel, the entire Disney universe melted down. My phone clattered away on vibrate as each new text came in, and once I pulled over, I saw a set of messages and emails that essentially said the same thing. Chapek was leaving his role as CEO. To put it bluntly, he was fired, and Iger was returning. And then, over the next few days, details, mostly arranged as leaks, began to emerge that offered a picture of a corporate board under duress, attempting to replace its CEO without further damaging its stock price. The story of Bob Chapek and Bob Iger is one that we've followed on these updates for the past 2.5 years. But the outcome of that story, and specifically the details that came out this past week, is not an ending that I could have possibly imagined 2 weeks ago. Today on the podcast, we're going to look at what happened. We're going to place it in context, and then we're going to explore what the great Disney reset of 2022 means for the future of the company. There's a lot here to cover, so if you're ready, let's go. From our perspective here, and with those inside Disney now more comfortable offering information, I think we can piece together a roadmap as to where things went wrong. A month before the pandemic, back in 2020, Bob Iger, longtime CEO of Disney, decided to finally step down and hand the reins of the company over to Bob Chapek, an executive with deep experience in consumer products and also experience with parks and resorts. It was a clear shift in corporate strategies that from a certain angle appeared calculated. Iger had been focused on growth. He had acquired Pixar, Marvel, Lucasfilm, and Fox. He had moved Disney into China, and he had set up Disney Plus, the company's premier streaming service. His focus was on mergers, international expansion, and a change in distribution models. Simply, Disney could not keep expanding. It needed to digest and develop the properties and divisions that Iger had started or acquired during his 15-year term as CEO. Chapek was far more of a financial manager, not a person interested in explosive growth. I suspect that this was the initial plan, that the expansion areas started by Iger would be reworked into a financially streamlined company under Chapek. From a certain standpoint, this appeared to be Chapek's most valuable asset as CEO, considering how the company had changed over the previous 15 years. But then favorable conditions around the company began to deteriorate. There was the pandemic, and like a financial manager, Chapek wanted to lay off tens of thousands of park cast members, but was stopped by Iger, who insisted they remain on payroll until the U.S. government initiated a support package. In ways, this clarified the division between the two Bobs. Bob Chapek placed high value on producing profit even at the expense of employees and later of fans, while Iger placed value on company unity even if that unity cost the company millions to achieve. Then there was a difference in tone and demeanor. Though Iger had expressed genuine enthusiasm and interest for many Disney films and parks, Chapek's financially centered worldview was on full display each time he talked to the press, referring to Disney as a brand and pointing to increased profits as justification for alienating fans with new pricing structures and a decrease in services. In ways, these elements were part of the package that the board approved. Chapek was a person who functioned more like a CEO of General Electric or Microsoft, one who didn't need to overly consider how the personality of the CEO fit or didn't fit the public image of the company, so long as he continued to move the massive international conglomerate that is Disney toward profitability. The next significant misstep concerned overhauling the company's media distribution model. In this, Bob Chapek favored a fiscal framework over the creative independence and authority of producers. As the Disney streaming service got off the ground, Chapek entirely remade the company's media distribution model, which shifted power from creative executives and then consolidated it under a new company division led by Kareem Daniel, a 14-year veteran of Disney who, like Chapek, also came from consumer products. Also like Chapek, Daniel had little previous experience with media, with his pre-Disney career beginning at Goldman Sachs and then moving to Disney's strategic planning division and then to the business side of Imagineering. In his new role, overseeing Disney media and entertainment distribution, Daniel would ultimately be responsible for show budgets and for how a film or a show was released, with an eye toward both generating profits and increasing subscribers on the streaming service. This new division, with little to no input from producers or directors, shifted some films once intended for theaters to Disney Plus, and shortened the release window for other films so that they showed up so quickly on Disney Plus as to increase its subscription base. In this, producers no longer felt in control of how their films were viewed by an audience. At the time, Chapek said, quote, "Managing content creation distinct from distribution will allow us to be more effective and nimble in making the content consumers most want delivered in the way they prefer to consume it. Our creative teams will concentrate on what they do best, making world-class franchise-based content, while our new centralized global distribution team will focus on delivering and monetizing that content in the most optimal way across all platforms, including Disney+, Hulu, ESPN+, and the coming Star International streaming service." Inside the company, this reorganization was deeply unpopular because executives who oversaw film production no longer had a voice in determining how a film was released. In particular, this strategy was despised by many at Pixar, who for 2 years saw their efforts relegated to Disney+. Moreover, it meant that two business executives, Kareem Daniel and Bob Chapek, who had little to no experience with film production, determined how films were released. The end result was that films such as Soul, Luca, Black Widow, and Cruella either premiered on Disney+, or premiered on Disney+, sometimes with an upcharge, the same day the film was released in theaters. The next significant problem happened in the summer of 2021. The new emphasis on Disney's control of distribution, primarily to benefit growth in the streaming service, led to a legal battle with Scarlett Johansson, star of Black Widow, where she accused Disney of withholding projected bonuses tied to box office income by releasing the film on Disney Plus for a $30 upcharge simultaneously with its theatrical release. The decision to release Black Widow day and date with Disney Plus in theaters was explained by Kareem Daniel as a financial necessity of the times. Quote, "By leveraging a flexible distribution strategy in a dynamic marketplace that is beginning to recover from the global pandemic," he said, "we will continue to employ the best options to deliver the Walt Disney Company's unparalleled storytelling to fans and families around the world." But this distribution change cut talent out of bonus revenue that had been fixed to pre-pandemic theatrical models. At the time, many studios were quietly and politely renegotiating deals with top stars whose films were being released either on PVOD or streaming services. There was nothing unusual about this conflict, but Chapek's handling of it in such a way as to suggest that Johansson's services might be replaceable developed into a public relations nightmare for the company, in which Chapek, an older white male with power, appeared to be bullying Johansson, a younger female star, from a position of privilege. The lawsuit was ultimately settled, with Disney paying Johansson, but the conflict cast Chapek in a poor light, one in which he didn't connect with creative talent, and one in which he used his position to extract financial concessions from production partners. In short, this conflict made some A-list talent hesitant to sign later deals with Disney, so long as the company was run by Bob Chapek. And then, early in 2022, Chapek engaged in a public quarrel with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis over the Florida Don't Say Gay bill. The approach to this issue, as well as the messaging, was overseen by Arthur Bachner, who functioned as Chapek's chief of staff. Like Kareem Daniel and other Chapek lieutenants, Bachner had risen up through consumer products as well. The messaging around the Florida bill not only upset many Disney employees, but ultimately resulted in the state of Florida creating a bill intended to wield the Reedy Creek Improvement District, that is essentially the governing body that controls the land in and around Disney World, away from Disney's control. As the Reedy Creek issue played out in newspapers across the country, investors started to notice that though the Disney streaming service was growing, it was not yet in a position to move toward profitability anytime soon. In fact, the streaming service, by scooping up films intended for theatrical distribution and by running multiple miniseries featuring stories from the universes of Star Wars and Marvel, was beginning to drag down company earnings by running the service at a deep loss to attract new customers. By this point, many rank-and-file cast members had lost patience with Chapek, particularly as they felt he was emotionally distant, not transparent, and didn't understand or respect the underlying values of the company. Some cast members drafted up multiple online petitions calling for his removal. But even as his popularity with cast members fell, Chapek still had the support of Susan Arnold, who oversaw the Disney Board of Directors. According to a source with The Hollywood Reporter, quote, Susan sided with Chapek from the beginning, even before Iger left. She tried to put Iger back into his box. At every turn, she said, let Chapek run the company. In part, this may have been an acknowledgement of the unique circumstances during which Chapek became CEO, with all Disney parks closed due to the pandemic, with the studio unable to release feature films to theaters, and with a hastening change in the way that audiences worldwide consumed media. Then, beyond this, at the midpoint of 2022, there was the Peter Rice incident, which didn't get as much media coverage as the Scarlett Johansson conflict, but for some inside the company, it was seen as a more serious issue as it affected the leadership quality of key company areas. In many ways, Peter Rice had experience in the areas where Chapek was floundering. Chapek had experience in parks and consumer products, and though fans bristled at upcharges and changes to the parks, at least those two areas produced a profit. But Chapek had very little experience with film and other media. And in the changing landscape of post-COVID theatrical releases and the expanding streaming service, those areas were floundering. This could have been an area where Peter Rice, with deep experience inside media and distribution, might have helped. In the early 2000s, Peter Rice had been president of Fox Searchlight Pictures, where he released a string of hits such as Napoleon Dynamite, Little Miss Sunshine, Bend It Like Beckham, Slumdog Millionaire, and Sideways, with those last two taking home Oscars for Best Picture. Beyond art house cinema, Rice had worked on films in the X-Men and Aliens franchise. He was the executive who oversaw the Fox Network Group, which included Fox, FX, and Nat Geo. When Disney bought Fox, Rice became the chairman of Walt Disney Television, which included all network programming except for ESPN. He would also oversee unscripted content for Disney+, such as The Magic of Disney's Animal Kingdom. In terms of an executive equal to Chapek, Rice was probably as close to this model as any executive at Disney. On June 9th, Chapek called Rice into his office and said that he was not fitting into the new Disney culture. Rice said that he thought he and Chapek and others were right then building the new Disney culture. When Rice asked for an explanation as to why he didn't fit in, Chapek reportedly told him, quote, "Now is not the time." The meeting then ended. Reportedly, it was 7 minutes in total. Rice, who had 2 years left on his contract, would be paid out in full by Disney. Executives released from high positions are often dismissed with dignity, with conversations and statements focused on their years in the business. Even though Rice started at Fox in 1989 and had risen to the highest ranks of that studio, he was dismissed as though he were a mid-level sales manager who didn't meet quotas one too many times. Inside the entertainment industry, some believed Chapek was removing the person who might successfully replace him if the Disney board chose not to renew his contract. That is, he was making himself seem more valuable to the company, as there was now no person from the Fox acquisition who might oversee a multi-faced media company if Chapek was released. This is also where the problems began for the board somewhere around June 2022. At this point, the board needed to either renew Chapek's contract, which was set to expire in a few months, or find a replacement. According to sources with the New York Times, some Disney executives, quote, "We're losing confidence in the CEO. These people said Mr. Chapek was perceived as having never truly won over creative executives at the company's TV and film studios and the designers of Disney theme parks known as Imagineers." A source for the Times also explained that the board, somewhere during this period, explored various options for a replacement or interim CEO, including Tom Staggs and Kevin Mayer, both former Disney executives who now ran Candle Media. Quote, "A person close to Disney's board had reached out to them this year with a hypothetical question. Would one or both be interested in returning to run Disney?" Though both Mayer and Staggs had deep experience with Disney, the board was likely primarily interested in Tom Staggs, who before leaving had a 27-year career with Disney, serving both as the chief operating officer and the chief financial officer, and therefore had understanding of the politics of the Disney C-suite. He had also been president of Disney Parks and Resorts as the company worked toward the Shanghai Park and deeply developed new areas in Florida such as Pandora. At one time, Staggs was considered Bob Iger's likely replacement, but Staggs left when he believed that he lacked board votes to gain this position, eventually starting Candle Media with another ex-Disney executive, Kevin Mayer. Mayer had once overseen the development of the Disney streaming service and had been the chief strategic officer of the company, managing the acquisition and integration of Pixar, Marvel, and Lucasfilm into Disney. But he left Disney 2 months after Chapek became CEO to be CEO of TikTok, presumably because he did not want to work under Chapek. Staggs was asked if he and Mayer together would hypothetically oversee the company if such an opportunity presented itself. But Staggs and Mayer set aside the question about becoming Disney's CEO or sharing the role, as to hire them, Disney would be contractually obligated to purchase Candle Media, which they assumed Bob Chapek would not do, as he would see its acquisition and the placement of Staggs and Mayer back inside of Disney as a threat to his position. The board also looked among its own members for an interim or replacement CEO. The Hollywood Reporter explained that, quote, "Some on the board wanted to replace Chapek and appoint one of their own, Nike chairman Mark Parker, as interim CEO while conducting a search for a new permanent leader." Beyond Nike, Parker was a member of the Disney board, so the initial impulse was to quietly explore the option among themselves. But Parker wasn't interested in taking on Disney. The board also considered longtime Disney board member and General Motors CEO Mary Barra, a woman whose entire career had been tied to GM. She probably wasn't a good match for the Disney role, but regardless, this proposal never found traction. Also during this period, Iger began to quietly criticize Chapek. These criticisms, for the most part, weren't made directly. They were part of conversations with friends who then acted as quiet surrogates, passing these reports, often anonymously, to reporters at trades and major newspapers. Even though these reports were without named sources, they were delivered through reliable journalists, which gave the information the air of truth, and which led to a lower level of company confidence in Chapek. The criticisms were almost always polite and well-structured, never an emotional attack, but they helped solidify a culture in which Chapek's failures were continually highlighted in the press, discussed on business networks, and then amplified over social media. The news from unnamed sources that appeared in major newspapers, as far as I can tell from this vantage point, held information that was either correct or mostly correct. Now that various options had been explored, even after the firing of Peter Rice at the start of summer 2022, Susan Arnold, the chair of the Disney board, was still supportive of Chapek, though there were now dissenters who believed he should be replaced. But the board now faced an investors' relations problem. As I mentioned, CEO contracts are typically renewed many months before they expire. In the summer of 2022, the window to renew was upon the board, as Chapek's contract would end in February 2023. If Chapek remained, the board, regardless of their personal opinions, needed to have public-facing support to bolster investor confidence, otherwise the stock price would drop. Not to show their support would lead to a loss of value. Again, according to The Hollywood Reporter, some on the board argued that they should renew Chapek's contract for a shorter period than the customary 3 years. They suggested 2 years. But that was argued down in part by Susan Arnold, as a short contract would also demonstrate a lack of faith in the CEO and therefore lead to a loss of corporate value. With this, the board renewed Chapek's contract for the usual term and publicly indicated that Chapek had their full support, which also demonstrated that the board approved of the way that Peter Rice had been let go, though clearly some on the board saw that as an indication that there were meaningful problems with Chapek. The Financial Times in London, using their sources, pieced together the story as it progressed from there. Quote, "The covert campaign to overthrow Chapek, which began in the summer, came after the outgoing chief executive lost the confidence of some members of his top team during the tumultuous 33 months. An unnamed source familiar with the board's actions explained, quote, "A lot of people were approaching the board, Iger loyalists who felt marginalized." The Times continued to explain that among those who complained was Disney CFO Christine McCarthy, who to the public appeared to be in support of Chapek. The Times explained that this detail in particular was confirmed by 3 individuals. With McCarthy, significant aspects of the C-suite were now moving against Chapek. But the big problem would arrive with the quarterly earnings report released on November 8th, a problem that was mostly focused on direct-to-consumer entertainment, which largely meant the Disney Plus streaming service. When Disney Plus premiered back in 2019, Bob Iger had priced the service with introductory rates. But in retrospect, it now seems clear that Bob Chapek waited too long to incrementally raise those prices. Bargain prices increased the subscription base and limited churn, but it led to a massive loss. One of the essential problems now, at least according to investors, is that Chapek's team offered no signals that the direct-to-consumer streaming service was hemorrhaging so much money to keep growth. But what's also clear in retrospect is part of the overall plan was to minimize the losses on the streaming service by upcharging most everything at the parks. In the short term anyway, the upcharges from Lightning Lanes and Genie Plus served to minimize concerns about the massive losses on Disney Plus. In terms of company-wide bookkeeping, Park guests who were seeing new categories of charges every few months, as well as increases to food and tickets, were subsidizing cheap subscription rates on Disney Plus designed to increase the subscriber base. No doubt some of the price increases at the parks were related to inflation and supply costs, but others now seem designed to offset losses elsewhere in the company. On the earnings call, Chapek didn't face the massive loss directly, nor did he take ownership of the issue. Instead, he made statements such as he saw, quote, outstanding growth at our direct-to-consumer services, and then he referenced, quote, the strategic decision we made at launch to heavily invest in our direct-to-consumer offering. Then he explained that later in the call, as though it were of little concern, the company's CFO, Christine McCarthy, quote, we'll go into more detail on the drivers of our direct-to-consumer operating performance and provide more insight into our expectations going forward and some of our key assumptions, but first I'd like to share a few highlights from the quarter. And then, somewhat oddly for an earnings call, he talked about minor community service during Hurricane Ian, quote, from packing thousands of meal kits to donating and delivering emergency supplies to the community. He then talked about relatively minor Halloween hard-ticket events, though enjoyed by fans, events that, due to their small size, brought only modest income into the Disney coffers. Quote, one of the things that guests loved most, he said, is the opportunity to celebrate at our parks as evidenced by the post-pandemic return and sellout of special ticketed events like Oogie Boogie Bash and Mickey's Not-So-Scary Halloween Party. The delivery of this information was arranged in part by Arthur Bachner, and its intent was clear, to minimize the true bombshell at the center of the earnings report. Then Chapek turned the call over to CFO Christine McCarthy, who discussed the direct-to-consumer issue. Quote, where our losses peaked in the fourth quarter at approximately $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion, to put this in perspective, is about the cost to make 6 Marvel films, or 30% of the overall budget to build Shanghai Disneyland. Or since Disney is a world of castles, for $1.5 billion, you could buy Buckingham Palace if it were for sale and still have $100 million left over. The loss, which was specifically $1.47 billion, was more than anyone expected Disney to lose, more than twice the division had lost the previous year. Chapek explained that he believed that the streaming service would still be profitable by 2024, but then added a caveat that a recession could delay its move to profitability. In this call, Chapek's underlying problem was on full display. Chapek had experience with parks and resorts and with consumer products. As CEO, Chapek had a plan for these divisions to financially succeed. And even if those plans angered fans of the parks, those plans contributed to the bottom line, at least in the short run. However, what seemed clear here was that Chapek didn't have a meaningful plan to manage studio output during a time when the entire ecosystem of American theaters was changing and when investors were quickly becoming more interested in profits from streaming services, including Disney Plus and Netflix, instead of growth arranged through massive losses, especially as the streaming game was becoming very crowded with new low-priced offerings. Since taking the reins of the company, Chapek added to the streaming service mainly by expanding the nature of the audience. Initially, Disney Plus was arranged for a multi-generational family audience, but under Chapek and Kareem Daniel, the streaming service sought to expand its numbers both through low-cost subscriptions and by acquiring material for viewers over the age of 13 and at times over the age of 18. These shows included such R-rated Marvel films as Logan and Deadpool, acquired through Fox, Daredevil, once it was no longer under contract with Netflix, Star Wars dramas directed at older viewers such as Andor, and live performance that would mostly appeal to older viewers such as Hamilton and Elton John's final concert in the U.S. Many of these efforts cost tens of millions and some over 100. It was clear to Chapek and Daniel that there weren't enough households interested in a family streamer to take on Netflix, so they remade the Disney streaming service in the image of Netflix by offering content with ratings from G to R in an attempt to expand the segments of their audience. This strategy was also in conflict to Iger's original plan, which sought a somewhat smaller audience for Disney+, but one that focused on the family-centered Disney brand, with other offerings spun off to Hulu. Unfortunately, Chapek's plan to create a streamer with entertainment tiers for all age groups was also the strategy of pretty much every streaming service. By 2022, most every studio and many networks had streaming services, far too many than could be adequately supported by viewers. Add into this that Disney was also showing softness in its linear network business as well. In short, it was clear that Chapek didn't have a unique plan to manage large media divisions within the company during a time when consumers radically changed how they experienced studio-produced films and shows. Chapek was mostly adding audience age tiers to Disney Plus without a plan to move toward profitability, and also without a meaningful plan to re-engage what remained of those in-person audiences in actual theaters, and also capture the most profitable positions from its linear offerings on cable TV. Now pile on all the previous problems. Chapek lacked the ability to connect with creative talent in Hollywood, and he had also managed to alienate many longtime Disney fans. Compared to recent CEOs at Disney such as Iger and Eisner, Chapek lacked a type of emotional presence and was unable to convey that films and experiences in the parks mattered to him in the same way they mattered to those who designed them, made them, and were fans of them. In short, he lacked a certain style that might be described as a combination of personal transparency combined with warmth. Though the earnings call was designed to contextualize this loss and move past it, investors on Wall Street noticed it. The following day, Disney stock slid 13%. It was Disney's largest one-day loss since the terrorist attacks in 2001 that shut down tourism across the country. It was also the lowest share price since Chapek took control of the company. 2 days later, Chapek, again discussing the situation only with his inner circle, announced that the company would initiate a hiring freeze. This announcement, too, caught senior managers by surprise, especially as some key divisions had been aggressively holding job fairs to fill gaps that remained empty since pandemic furloughs and layoffs, such as when Disney laid off 28,000 cast members in the fall of 2020, including skilled positions the company hasn't yet been able to fully recapture. In short, Chapek's hiring freeze seemed like a knee-jerk reaction to create the appearance of control, without taking into account where hiring was necessary to increase profitability. These elements together moved the board to look for a way to immediately remove Chapek as CEO. The twin problems that reportedly pushed the board to this point were the $1.47 billion loss inside the streaming service and the way the information was presented during the call. According to a source with the Los Angeles Times, quote, "And the board came to the conclusion that they were losing the heart and soul of the company. This may have seemed quick, but the creative community has been saying it was just a matter of time. The situation wasn't tenable." Though Iger's name had likely been previously discussed by the board as an interim choice for CEO, at this point the board began to consider that option with greater seriousness. In terms of a visual demonstration, the return of Iger would suggest that the board was wiping away the period of Chapek entirely and dialing back the company to 2020, when Iger still ran things. The company's current problems were media-centered, which was Iger's strength. But one of Iger's failures had been finding a suitable successor for the role of CEO. which was also something that Iger would need to do if, in fact, he again led the company. According to the New York Times, quote, negotiations between Mr. Iger and the board to return as CEO were initiated only in recent days, suggesting that a viable plan to replace Chapek was only put into play after the disastrous November 8th earnings call and the decision to initiate a hiring freeze. So this puts serious conversations developing during the week of November 14th. In retrospect, it's clear that at some point during that week, a deal was developing. Iger was talking with investors who were meeting with other executives in entertainment companies. These meetings were part of a bus tour arranged by Michael Nathanson of MoffettNathanson, who closely watches Disney. And oddly, among the people they met was Bob Iger, who officially no longer worked for any entertainment company, though he was politely critical of Chapek's tenure as CEO. According to the news site Puck, Iger, quote, did share concerns about the company's recent performance and strategy, which, from our vantage point now, almost surely suggests that by this point, Iger was preparing key investors for his possible return by highlighting how his management of the company would be different than that of Chapek. At best, this was little more than a minor irritant to Chapek at the time, the past CEO second-guessing the person now in charge. On November 18th, according to the New York Times, quote, Susan Arnold, the board chair, called Mr. Iger, age 71, at 3 p.m. on Friday and asked him to return. And then the details were hammered out without telling Bob Chapek. In the end, Bob Iger agreed to return for 2 years. He would work on fixing current problems inside the company, and he would also focus on finding a new successor. For Disney, the other big event that weekend was the final U.S. show of Elton John's farewell tour, which would be aired live on Disney+, which was another expensive program to increase the subscription base with an adult audience. Elton John did have some connection to Disney, particularly through the songs in The Lion King, but the concert was arranged to feature songs from his 43-year career as a rock and pop icon. But as millions were preparing to say goodbye to Elton John while watching his farewell concert streamed on Disney Plus or live at Dodger Stadium, the Disney board was now prepared to say farewell to someone else. According to the Wall Street Journal, quote, Mr. Chapek was also expected to attend the Elton John event, and the company had planned for him to introduce Mr. John from the stage before the concert, according to two people with knowledge of the plans. But somewhere during this window, Susan Arnold, chair of the Disney board, was explaining to Chapek that he was, in essence, fired. No one would use that term, but all of this amounts to the same thing. The phone call was brief, though it's unclear if this was intentional. The brevity and directness of the call mimicked the style with which Chapek had recently fired Peter Rice. In the trades, it would be suggested that this was a type of professional payback. Shortly after Arnold spoke with Chapek, Bob Iger sent an email to employees to explain that he was returning to the company. Quote, It is with an incredible sense of gratitude and humility, he wrote, and I must admit a bit of amazement, that I write to you this evening with the news that I am returning to the Walt Disney Company as Chief Executive Officer. Many key executives were in a closed-off VIP pre-concert reception area for the Elton John event when they received an email claiming that Iger was taking over the company. At this point, some were confused as to why Chapek wasn't in the VIP area with them. They received the message on their cell phones. Again from the Wall Street Journal, quote, Other Disney employees said they were baffled by Iger's Sunday email and immediately began asking if the message to employees was real or if it came from a hacked email account. The email was quickly forwarded, and in the parks, mostly off-stage, cast members passed phones back and forth. At Disney World, when the news broke, the only park that was open was the Magic Kingdom, which was hosting a Mickey's Very Merry party. Multiple people have told me that in at least a few of these shops and ride areas, frontline cast members let out a whoop of delight when they saw the news online. In California, however, the parks were open. Many execs shared the news with cast members so that cast members wouldn't first hear it from guests. And from there, the Disney segment of the internet lit up, mostly with delight. Though fans had had criticisms of Iger during his 15-year term as CEO, he was universally seen as a superior candidate over Chapek, who during his 2.5 years had earned online nicknames such as Bob Paycheck and Bob Cheapnick, both referring to his emphasis on money over quality. It is rare for consumers to take much interest in the movement of CEOs and other executives. But what Chapek failed to understand is that Disney, as a set of ideas or something like a moral code or a foundation of stories that helped shape individuals' young lives, had deeper connections for many lifelong fans. Chapek was often confused as to why these connections mattered to some fans. As recently as an October interview with the Wall Street Journal, Chapek said, quote, "When our fans and our audiences put their kids to bed at night after watching Pinocchio or Dumbo or The Little Mermaid, they're probably not going to tune into another animated movie. They want something for themselves." That is, Chapek himself was not a fan of Disney's animated films, and he assumed that most all, if not all adults were just like him. In other words, as CEO, he could not see beyond his own experience to understand fans who were attached to the company. Other times on earnings calls overseen by Chapek, annual pass holders were referred to as a contingency plan. And when too many annual pass holders were inside of Disneyland, as opposed to higher spending guests with day tickets, Chapek referred to this combination as, quote, "an unfavorable mix." As a result, the Facebook groups and online forums dedicated to the parks were particularly active with gleeful notes about Chapek's departure. The following day, a Monday, Disney stock rose by almost 7% in late morning trading. Also on Monday, Iger fired one of Chapek's lieutenants, Kareem Daniel, whose distribution division was a key difference between Iger's approach of respecting the creative community and Chapek's approach of managing them. Chapek's approach essentially was to centralize power and decision-making. Under Iger, executives in each division had meaningful control over financial and production issues, allowing for a decentralized approach in which each of the Disney-owned studios managed its own decisions. In an email, Iger said, quote, "Over the coming weeks, we will begin implementing organizational and operating changes within the company. It is my intention to restructure things in a way that honors and respects creativity as the heart and soul of who we are." The next person to be released was Arthur Bachner, another Chapek lieutenant who had overseen messaging concerning Disney's response to the Florida bill and also the script for the earnings call on November 8th. In this, Disney was shedding consumer products people who had been elevated to executive positions to oversee a creative company. And in this, the transformation from Chapek's regime to the one organized by Iger was just beginning. I know that it's easy for park fans to believe that the firing of Bob Chapek had to do with his mishandling of the parks, for a reservation system for Genie Plus, and a dozen other ways that the resorts now nickel and dime guests to increase profits, and for the lack of expansion projects as Universal builds a new park in Florida and continues to expand its park in California. But some of these plans, such as for the general Genie Plus concept, at least in their early form, date back to Iger's days as CEO. These elements may not have been implemented in the exact same way, but the structure was being developed during Iger's reign. Other issues, though, such as the lack of forward-looking capital investment in the parks, falls more squarely on Chapek, but more on that in a moment. When Iger first became CEO back in 2005, the company was valued at $48 billion. Over his 15 years as CEO, the value grew to $257 billion. It increased in value over fivefold, and by doing so, Iger developed Disney into a Hollywood powerhouse. During Chapek's time, however, the company's value fell to $164 billion. That is, it lost 35% of its value. Part of this was related to the pandemic, to difficulties in operating theme parks at full capacity, and to changes in the theatrical distribution model. But part of that, a large part now, according to the Disney board, is the fault of Chapek's leadership. Iger will almost surely bring the company back to something that more resembles his version of Disney. Aside from the company's expansion into China, his strengths were centered in acquisitions and in integrating new studio areas into the Disney organization. Obvious candidates for deeper integration are Fox and National Geographic, neither of which have found sure footing inside of the Disney brand yet. But also, there are some other areas that may be adjusted under his watch. I suspect that there might be some changes at Lucasfilm. Though the Star Wars franchise has been central to Disney+, nothing much is in the works for theatrical releases there. Marvel, in ways, has the opposite problem. Marvel is performing well both theatrically and on the streaming service. But the pressure to continually produce new material limits how well the master narrative for the current phase is functioning. Whereas it was clear early on in Phase 2 and 3 that there was an organized and coordinated narrative move to the Infinity Stones and Thanos, the breadcrumbs are nowhere near as controlled in the current phase. Phase 4, that is the current phase, seems mostly designed to introduce new characters, and a lot of them, and to explore the concept of a multiverse. Beyond this, under Chapek, both Disney and Pixar animated features have largely been arranged to help the streaming service. Even when animated features are released to theaters, they quickly end up over on Disney+. Even before the surprisingly poor box office results this past weekend, it seemed clear that executives were eyeing Strange World, released at Thanksgiving, as the surprise gift to show up on Christmas Day on the streaming service, just like Encanto last year and sort of like Soul the year before. The very modest and somewhat incoherent marketing plan for Strange World strongly suggests that, at least until Iger took over, this was the plan for that film as well. And beyond this, one of the questions that I've had for a while concerns Avatar 2: The Way of Water, which is set to be released in less than 3 weeks. There's some advertising for it, but there's very little buzz. And again, the advertising is not arranged in a way to entice viewers through narrative hooks that were once central to Disney trailers. James Cameron has directed major films that have performed extremely well at the box office, such as the original Avatar, Titanic, Terminator 2, and Aliens. And he's also directed some films that have done middling well, such as The Abyss and True Lies. The promotion for this new film, which would have fallen generally under Kareem Daniels' purview, seems problematic, as Avatar is rumored to cost $250 million. Not only that, this film is designed to set up a string of 3 more Avatar sequels. Let's say that each of these 4 films has a budget of about $250 million, and each of these films has an advertising and promotional budget somewhere around $125 to $150 million. That puts the total price tag for these productions at $1.5 billion. Even though Chapek recently tried to minimize the $1.5 billion streaming loss in the last earnings call, $1.5 billion is a massive figure. There are some films with higher production budgets than Avatar 2, but there's not a lot of them. In fact, there's only 16, mostly films with deep levels of digital effects such as the Avengers films, a number of Star Wars films, and oddly, Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. That is, Avatar 2 is a film that Disney needs to protect not only for its current production costs, but also because it sets up a series of very expensive sequels that are already in production. If people don't see this one, which sets up the story, they're unlikely to jump in on the next installment. Beyond this new film itself, the Avatar franchise supports the theme park land of Pandora that Disney is at least considering to replicate overseas, perhaps as a replacement for the abandoned Galaxy's Edge project in Paris. Anyways, these problems all fall into Iger's area of strength, integrating and balancing the work of various studios so together they contribute to the company as a whole. In terms of the park, Disney presently has very little in the pipeline. Also, Imagineering has lost hundreds and hundreds of artists, architects, engineers, and other specialists. Fixing Imagineering, if that is part of the plan, will be more difficult than simply opening up the money spigot to approve new projects. The one attraction that was kind of announced for the American parks at the D23 Expo was clearly a downgrade to the original Avengers attraction once slotted for DCA, with its inventive and likely costly ride system that would allow guests to move individually around the battle show stage of Wakanda. The replacement attraction with King Thanos appears to be screen-based. Otherwise, how would an attraction include so many different characters? And the ride system appears to be arranged around a familiar ride vehicle. It looks very much like a 12-seat Time Rover or Indiana Jones vehicle. That is, the scant artwork presented suggested that instead of inventing some new ride system, Imagineers would now adapt a system that already existed. To look at this from an optimistic standpoint, Iger has a history of greenlighting expensive projects that incorporate new technology to create robust attraction experiences. Think of Rise of the Resistance or Flight of Passage. Those were done under Iger's watch. Aside from bringing studio media to profitability and developing a successor, which will be Chapek's main jobs, I suspect that another early task will be to rebuild Imagineering to a level where it can better handle projects. It's my understanding that Imagineering is still struggling to find cohesion at the moment. Hopefully the plan is to lure back many key individuals who left, either because of Chapek's management style or to avoid the forced move to Lake Nona, Florida. In terms of that Lake Nona campus itself, very little work has been done on the construction site beyond some basic land prep. I've been told by two people that though some Disney employees have already relocated to Florida ahead of the Lake Nona construction, it's unlikely that the Lake Nona project will move forward at least as originally planned. The original plan was to anchor a corporate division in Florida. Perhaps some smaller version of this plan might eventually emerge, but I believe signs point to the corporate divisions remaining fully in California. Beyond these things, the plan moving forward may also be to remove some of the cheapness and limited vision from those projects that Chapek supported. Again, this is an optimistic view of Iger's return, as clearly his return has far more to do with preparing the various Disney studios to find a profitable path forward in a world now focused on streaming, a world in which theaters still exist, but theatrical releases are far less profitable than they were before the pandemic, and a world in which the television networks that Disney oversees, like all networks, continue to lose viewership. That is, Iger needs to arrange a multi-tiered delivery strategy for the content that Disney produces, a strategy that fairly quickly moves to profitability. In terms of what fans want for the parks, I don't know how much Iger will be able or even be willing to accommodate. Elevations in park income have been driven by strategies put online during Chapek's tenure, such as Genie Plus and Lightning Lanes, but these were both in development while Iger was CEO. But clearly there are problems with Genie Plus and Lightning Lanes in the implementation. I was in the Magic Kingdom last Monday, the Monday before Thanksgiving, and was stunned at the length of some Lightning Lanes, especially as the Genie Plus service was $29 per person that day. The Lightning Lane for Peter Pan stretched back to the carousel. The Lightning Lane for the mansion stretched to the Hall of Presidents. Lightning Lanes are sold as bypass-the-line products, but each of these Lightning Lanes was at least 30 minutes long. With this arrangement during holiday periods, no one's needs were being served. The highest priced days for Genie Plus are those in which the service is least valuable. Something needs to be revised here, as overall ride capacity remains an issue, particularly during the holiday periods. Essentially, too many guests are buying this product during peak periods, only to find that the parks don't have enough capacity to deliver on what Genie Plus promised, a payment to bypass many lines. I will say that on an average weekday in October or May, Genie Plus works well both in Florida and California, but on peak days, particularly in Florida, where parks have lower attraction inventory than at Disneyland, the system is a mess just waiting to explode. Beyond this, once Iger has a plan in place to better manage media distribution toward profitability, which again is the locus of his mandate, I'm guessing he'll roll back or alter some of Chapek's changes to the park. I suspect this will be minimal, and the targets will both please fans and also raise profits. But even a few changes here will be viewed by the park community as gifts from a returning hero, such as the reinstatement of Magical Express, a service from which, even with the existence of Uber, Disney largely benefits, or the removal of reservations, if only during non-holiday periods. I understand that a reservation system may be a logistical necessity for guests during the winter holidays in terms of capacity and staffing concerns, but what is the point of requiring reservations on a random Tuesday in September? I've also heard that some version of this rollback has been considered for a couple of months, but no specifics have yet been released. This period right now is, in many ways, the big Disney reset of 2022. It will be a washing away of some of Chapek's financially centered management style, which often had been implemented at the expense of creative executives, but also there's something larger here, a true X factor that may prove useful. CEOs rarely have meaningful time to reflect and reconsider their own plans and strategies. Typically, each week brings a new set of problems. But Iger officially stepped down as CEO almost 3 years ago, and he separated from the company entirely last year. During that process, especially over the past 12 months, he's had an opportunity to view the Disney company from a distance and examine it with a type of objectivity that current CEOs don't have. It's possible that through this period, he was not only able to interrogate Chapek's management style, but maybe he was able to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of his own period as CEO. If so, that X factor may bring an added depth of thought and consideration in restructuring the company in a post-Chapek period. Another big question in all of this is, on a personal level, why is Iger returning? Though Iger's term as CEO wasn't perfect, it was almost as good as it gets in a post-Walt, post-Roy incarnation of the Disney company. Sure, Iger increased prices. He focused on restructuring the company as an international conglomerate, and he scaled back on animation. but the positives in his tenure far outweigh any shortcomings. In terms of value, the company grew by over 500% during his 15-year period as CEO. In terms of his own legacy, he puts all of this at risk by returning. One of the reasons he returns clearly is that he's deeply attached to the company and to what it represents. Also, based on the sniping and quiet comments passed to the press through surrogates, he regretted naming Chapek as his successor almost the moment that it happened. This is his one chance to undo that error, clean up what he saw as a lingering and deep problem in the company. It's also a chance for him to rethink the qualities needed to best run the company. Chapek almost surely was chosen as a financial manager to arrange Iger's acquisitions into a cohesive company, one focused on profits and integration. That model, at least for Disney, was clearly a failure. And so, with Iger's return, he has an opportunity to rethink the qualities necessary to lead one of the largest media and entertainment companies in the world. And there's also this. On the day after Iger was rehired, Doug Kreutz, an analyst, explained that 2 more years of Iger might make it even more difficult for another person to take over the company, especially if Iger is successful. Success would serve to raise an already high bar in terms of expectations for executive performance once Iger steps down a second time. Quote, "We do not necessarily think that a lack of leadership is Disney's problem," Kreutz said, "and think the change will ultimately make a true transition of power to Iger's next successor even more difficult." This may or may not prove true. What is happening right now, though, is simple. Bob Iger is returning to a company that he once led to hopefully right its course and to find a successor CEO who will lead with better results this time after these 2 years come to an end. Most who work for the company and who are fans are excited about this change, as it indicates that there's something essential about the Disney company, about being involved in the Disney stratosphere, that can't be successfully arranged by a financially focused manager. In essence, the fans and also the accountant's spreadsheet have convinced the board that this is the case, that Disney is a unique company and needs oversight different than that of General Electric or Ford. How will this all work out? Well, of course we don't yet know. But the day after this episode posts on Monday, November 28th, Bob Iger will host a town hall discussion with cast members to answer questions and explain how he will direct the company over the next 2 years. And that, I think, is a pretty good first step. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode. And at least right now, the plan is to continue our story about Disney artist Herb Ryman, who helped define the look of Disney films and the Disney parks in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and far beyond. If you'd like to support our podcast by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber, you can do so by visiting our Bandcamp site. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 100 episodes not available on iTunes, but the best reason to join is to support the work we do here. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. You can become a monthly supporter at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link over in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.